We've got so much data from over the years on how big of a factor home advantage is in regions of the world like Canada, Brazil, and the UK because of how many events the UFC have held in these countries throughout their history. But it's only really since COVID that the UFC started to hold a lot of events in the Middle East. So up until recently, we didn't really have a big enough sample size of data to figure out how big of a factor home advantage is in countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, or Qatar, where the UFC is holding their event this weekend. So, round about this time last year, I did a study on how big of an advantage Muslim fighters have when they compete against non-Muslim fighters in the United Arab Emirates, and it turns out that they have a pretty big statistical advantage. Now, obviously, Muslim fighters come from all over the world, and when we're talking about home advantage in places like Canada and Brazil, it's way easier to quantify, right? Because a Brazilian is a Brazilian, Canadian is a Canadian. But Muslim fighters come from all over the world, but what we found is when they compete in countries like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, they win a very high percentage of the time. Now, when I first started working on this study, I thought that was because Muslim fighters would be given favourable matchups in these countries, just like if the UFC are holding an event in the UK, they want, homegrown British fighters to win, to please the crowd, to please their fans. So they often give them favourable matchups, so the British fighters will get a few big wins. I thought the reason why we saw a high percentage of Muslim fighters win on events in the United Arab Emirates may have been due to favourable matchmaking, but when I took a deep dive into the data, I found that actually, even in matchups where the odds were in the even money odds range, or even in matchups where the Muslims were the underdogs and it was perceived to be a tough fight for them, they still won a very high percentage of the time, up into that 70% range. And if you come to my website, I'll leave a link to this study below. Check out in the description. I've done a video where I go through all the data, all the stuff I kind of looked into, and it turns out that Muslim fighters just have a massive advantage when they compete in this part of the world. I don't know if it's favourable refereeing. I know MMA Guru has made a video on this in terms of, I think he did a really good video where he focused on the Nathaniel Wood versus Naimov fight, where Naimov committed something like 12 fouls in the fight and wasn't given a single point deduction, albeit they were different fouls, but still, Naimov basically cheated his way to a win. If it's biased judging, or if the Muslim fighters are energized by performing in this part of the world in front of fans that really appreciate and love them, and that elevates their performance in the same way that when Molly McCann or Paddy Pimblett would fight in Liverpool, they would feed off the energy of the crowd, right? So the UFC, this is going to be the first time they've held an event, I believe, in Qatar. They may have held an event there once or twice in the past, but they don't hold many events in Qatar. But because you're going to get the same squad of judges and referees working this event in Doha this weekend as you would if the event was taking place in Abu Dhabi or Dubai, then I would assume that you will get a similar level of home advantage for Muslim fighters facing non-Muslims this weekend. Now, why have I opened up the video with that? I've opened up the video for that because that kind of factor means that you approach betting a card like this in a very different way to how you would approach betting a card where home advantage isn't really a factor, or home advantage isn't as big of a factor as it's likely to be this weekend. So what we're going to be doing as we work through breaking down each of these fights is very much focusing on home advantage, because we know that if Muslim fighters win around 70% of the time 7-0 when they face non-Muslims in countries such as this, the low-hanging fruit, the easiest path to profitability this weekend will be to try and find, decent value bets on Muslims facing non-Muslims. And we know that, even just betting blind and knowing absolutely nothing about the sport, if you bet on Muslims versus non-Muslims over the long term in countries like Qatar, you're going to win around 70% of the bets. So it's much easier to be profitable betting with strong trends in your favour than trying to fight strong trends, and that's really going to be the theme of this video. So we're going to be focusing heavily on that. So I want to open up with that just so everyone understands that we approach a card like this very differently. That also very much applies to live betting. And so, you know, if you spend hours every week watching breakdown videos, you know, my breakdown videos along, I'm sure you watch other people's breakdown videos as well. If you put a lot of time and effort into thinking about your bets for every UFC card, which I'm pretty sure everyone watching this does, otherwise you wouldn't be going to the effort of spending time to watch a video like this, just consider whether it's worth it. Just consider if you want to do that. Just consider if, you know, you would prefer to be doing other things like hanging out with your family, you know, playing some video games, watching a movie, maybe building a business, maybe learning some new skills. There's plenty of the ways that you could be spending your time other than spending hours and hours and hours doing fight research every week. Because if you did want to outsource making money betting on the sport you love to someone like me, you can see that our profitability chart for live betting this sport is incredibly impressive. We make a profit on around 73% of months, so you're going to make a profit almost every month of the year in my live betting group, which gives you a bit of reliable cash flow to, you know, earn money from betting the sport you absolutely love. And there's been a huge upgrade to my live betting service very recently. As of this week, in fact, you don't even need to listen to my live betting commentary anymore to get my live betting tips. You can get them through audio notifications on your phone. So if you've been in my live betting group before and you didn't really like it because my commentary was ahead of your stream, and so you kind of got a lot of spoilers and it ruined the viewing experience of watching the UFC, and you thought, you know what, as much as it's nice making money, this is kind of ruining the entertainment for me because, you know, I'm not enjoying the sport in the moment anymore because I'm hearing Allsop telling me what's going to happen in 30 seconds from my broadcast. You don't even have to worry about that anymore. You can just get audio notifications for live bets. You don't have to even listen to the commentary, and the latency, the delay on these live betting notifications are within 20 milliseconds. So it is instant, which again gives you a huge edge over the competition because when I drop the bets, they are ahead of anyone else in the world, anyone else in this game. The speed at which I deliver my bets to you through either the audio stream or the live notifications, it's faster than anyone else in the world, and every second counts in live betting. The fact we're 1 to 2 seconds ahead of everybody is just another reason why our edge is so big, and why we make a profit almost every month of the year, and why we make a profit on almost every UFC event. So I'm very confident that we'll make a profit this weekend. We tend to do extremely well live betting cards like this. So join the team, come on board, stop stressing about your own fight research and your own bets and fighting hard to make a bit of money every week. Outsource the problem to a guy like me. Save yourself time. Go do something way more fun, way more enjoyable. Turn up on Saturday night and have a stress-free money-making experience which you'll absolutely love. Join the team, join the group, and you won't regret it. Now we're going to jump into the main event of this weekend's card, which is not that interesting of a main event, to be fair. And this is the kind of fight where, when I spoke about favourable matchmaking and that being a contributing factor to the reason why so many Muslim fighters beat non-Muslims in parts of the world like Qatar on UFC events, this fight is a really good example of that, because Arman Tsarukyan is obviously a Muslim, Dan Hooker is very obviously not a Muslim, and in order to give the fans a big win, something to celebrate, you know, to get behind their guy, they've given Tsarukyan an extremely favourable matchup here, to the point where he's one of the biggest favourites on the card at around 1.16, which is minus 615 odds, which gives him an implied probability of 86%. So for those of you that are new to betting on sports, you don't know what implied probability means, in order to make betting on sports very difficult for people to make money from, bookies thought it would be a great idea to create this random thing called betting odds, which ultimately are a metric to disguise the assigned probability they give of something happening. So for example, the main event's not a great example of this, but if we go to a fight, for example, Let's find a really good one, a fight that people are going to be very interested in this weekend. In fact, there's not a whole lot of them. Okay, I'm saying that because there's not a whole lot of big, kind of interesting fights on this card, right? We've got a lot of big favourites who should win easily. Let's use Volkan Oezdemir versus Alonzo Menifield as an example. I'm pretty sure most people watching this will favour Volkan Oezdemir winning this fight. People will have varying degrees of confidence in his ability to win. And his odds are 1.43, which is minus 235, which people might not really, care too much about. They'll be like, oh, I think Volkan Oezdemir is going to win this easily. I'm going to bet him at odds of 1.43, right? Pretty steep favourite odds, but I'm going to bet him anyway. But in actual fact, what they are basically doing when they place in that bet, mathematically, is giving Volkan Oezdemir a 75% or better chance of winning the fight. So if you ask most people watching this, they'll be like, yeah, I think Oezdemir is going to win easily. But if you ask them, do you think he wins 75% of the time or more, you're going to get a lot of people not that confident. And if you're not that confident, you shouldn't bet Oezdemir, because that's the confidence level you need in order to justify a bet on him. So betting odds confuse and muddy the water and try and distract people from the deal that they're actually getting, which is why we talk a lot about implied probabilities on this channel. And as you can see, the implied probability on Arman Tsarukyan is absolutely massive. And if you do like this tool, by the way, this UFC research tool, you can get this by joining my community. In fact, if you join the live betting group, you get this as part of your membership. And to access it, you just come up to tools, go to the UFC research tool, and everything you see in this video, you can gain access to it. So in order to justify a bet on Tsarukyan, you've got to give him about a 90% chance of winning, which is a very, very steep price to pay. But at the same time, this is one of those fights where you look at it and you go, there are very limited paths to victory here for Dan Hooker. It's a very, very difficult fight for him. So we've already spoken about how big of a deal home advantage is. And now let's take a little look at the fighter comparison, where you start to see some advantages creep in for Tsarukyan. So he's 7 years younger than Dan Hooker, which is a pretty big deal, because as you can see from Dan Hooker's record, he's had 34, so he's had 36 pro fights, which is a lot of fights because he's been in a lot of wars, right? If we take a look at his record, he's taken a bunch of damage, he's TKO'd here, he's TKO'd here, and he's also spent a lot of time in the octagon, putting a lot of wear and tear on his body, going to these decisions against some of the best fighters of all time in the lightweight division, right? So Hooker's got a lot of miles on the clock. Those 36 pro fights are paid in full. So even though Hooker's not crazy old for 35, he does have a lot of miles on the clock. And Arman Tsarukyan's only 28 years old, so he's going to be getting better from fight to fight. So statistically, we know that the younger fighter wins around 67% of the time when there's a 7-year age gap in a fight. And when you throw into the mix the fact that Tsarukyan's probably got home advantage on his side as well, the advantages still start to rack up. Now that is somewhat offset by Hooker's size and reach advantage, 5-inch height advantage, 3-inch reach advantage, 3-inch leg reach advantage. But I do think that every body type has strengths and weaknesses, and while Hooker does do a good job of using his length, because he's long and tall, and Tsarukyan is shorter, more compact, has a smaller muscular frame, just being 5'7" versus 6 foot tall is going to make it much easier for Tsarukyan to drive in deep on the legs and shoot nicely timed deep double leg takedown attempts on Hooker, and will more likely make it more easier for Tsarukyan to get him down. So if we take a look at the stats behind this one, you can see that Hooker lands about 30% more strikes per minute. They have the same accuracy level. Tsarukyan's slightly better defensively, but then you can see the real difference between these two. Tsarukyan is way more aggressive with the takedowns, shoots a pretty high volume of takedowns per fight. Both guys have very good takedown defense. We'll get into the nuances of this shortly. And you can see in terms of the strike distribution chart, they're pretty much even, with both of them mainly targeting the head, but through their kicking game, throwing about 30% of strikes, 25 to 30% of their strikes to the body and legs respectively. So that's how the stats are matching up. How do they match up from a stylistic point of view? Well, if we look at Dan Hooker's record and take a look at the granular stats, and again, if you're not a member of my community and you want to get access to all this data, just go to Tools UFC Research Tool, and you can see some granular stats for some of Hooker's recent fights. You can see against Mateusz Gamrot, he defended 10 of the 15 takedowns that Gamrot attempted. And against Puelles, even more impressive. Puelles attempted 8 takedowns. You can see that Dan Hooker defended every single one of them. And if you want to watch these fights, all you need to do is click these links here. These links will take you. You want to watch a Gamrot fight? Boom, you click that, and it will take you to watch the Gamrot fight. Nice and easy, right? The perfect research tool. Everyone should have this research tool in their toolkit. If you bet on MMA, this will make everything so much easier for you, so much data all in one place. So you can see did pretty good defending the takedowns against both Puelles and Mateusz Gamrot. And if you consider how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, obviously Hooker's best chance of winning this, causing an upset, is on the feet. And we know Tsarukyan's going to have a pretty big advantage on the ground. But when you consider how well Hooker's done defending takedowns against decent offensive wrestlers recently, and you look at the fact that he's got 78% takedown defense, the statistics, the numbers suggest that this could be a stand-up fight. But in reality, when you look at how they both match up stylistically, I think if Arman Tsarukyan wants to use his grappling in this fight, I think he's going to have a lot of success with it. And the reason being, Tsarukyan's a very high-level striker. He's a very technical striker, and he's got great cardio. And this is really where he differs from guys like Puelles and Gamrot, and is a way tougher challenge, because Puelles and Gamrot, they're not the level of striker that Tsarukyan is. So Tsarukyan can set up his takedowns way better than guys like Gamrot and Puelles, because he can disguise his takedown entries, because he poses a really big threat to Hooker on the feet. He moves very well. He's really technical. He throws a nice diverse range of strikes. Also, on top of that, he doesn't slow down. So if you look at the Gamrot fight in particular, we can see on Hooker's record, you know, there were 5 takedowns that he didn't stuff against Gamrot. And if you go back and watch that fight, you can see early in the fight, Gamrot was getting Hooker down relatively easily. But then Gamrot gassed himself out, spamming takedowns. And that's when Hooker, in the second half of the fight, started to have a lot of success defending the takedowns. The difference with Tsarukyan is, because he's a cardio machine, he won't slow down. So whereas Hooker's been able to weaponize his cardio against guys like Puelles, guys like Gamrot, and make them burn themselves out and fade through spamming takedown attempts, he's not going to have that luxury with Tsarukyan. So from my perspective, this is a great fight for Tsarukyan over 5 rounds, because he's tough, he's durable, he's got great cardio, he's very well rounded, and I think he's the more technical striker, and he's by far the more skilled grappler. He may not have like the raw power to hurt you like Hooker does. I know Hooker doesn't have too many knockout wins on his record recently, but over the years we've seen him catch guys with the odd nasty knee up the middle, their big elbow to put them away. But typically when Hooker does finish guys, it's through him kind of dragging them into deep waters and wearing them down and breaking them down and taking them out with volume, as opposed to landing that one kill shot that's going to be a flash KO. So Tsarukyan, from my perspective, is the better striker. He's the better grappler. He should win this pretty easily this weekend. Home advantage is certainly a little sweetener to that. And so while his implied probability is a very steep price to pay, I would be quite amazed if he were to lose, which is the reason why I think he's not a bad parlay option. I have thrown Tsarukyan into a parlay with Oralbai. Since I placed that bet on Monday, it's now Friday, you know, the odds have declined, you know, on both Tsarukyan and quite a bit on Oralbai. They've declined by about 20% on Oralbai. So I am betting Tsarukyan and Oralbai. I think they both win quite easily, but yeah, it's a steep price to pay. I just think it's super unlikely that Hooker will win this weekend. So in terms of the over-under on this one, Let's take a little look into the over-under. I do think this fight is quite likely to go deep. The over 2.5 rounds is very tempting just because of how tough both guys are. If we take a look at Hooker's record, you can see that he is a bit of a decisionator. You can see, decision. If we dig into the fights that have ended inside the distance, they tend to be where Hooker has been finished against guys with a lot of raw power, like a Michael Chandler or an Arnold Allen. Tsarukyan doesn't really have that raw power. He's more of a volume striker, and the only other time he's been finished is against one of the best MMA grapplers to ever live in Islam Makhachev. And whilst Tsarukyan is a very good MMA grappler, I don't think he's as dangerous with his submission game as Makhachev is. And if we look at his record, it kind of reflects that, where you can see he's had some grappling matches over the last couple of years and shit like that, but prior to that, decision, Dariush's chin isn't where it was. That fight went into the third round, decision. Joe Alvarez just got mauled on the ground, but Hooker's better at defending himself than Joel Alvarez, and then a bunch of decisions. So I do think styles make fights, and I do think it's quite likely this fight creeps over the 2.5 minute mark. So the over 2.5 rounds not actually a bad bet in my opinion. I might take that myself. And in terms of the props, I think the most likely outcome is going to be Tsarukyan by decision. The odds aren't great, to be fair, so I think chucking Tsarukyan into a parlay with someone like Oralbai and going for that over is probably the best move. But let me know what you think in the chat room on the website. We've got the brand new chat room. Let me know what you think in the comments below if you're watching on YouTube. And now let us move on to the next. Now let's break down the fight between Belal Muhammad and Ian Garry. It's a very, very interesting matchup. If you're watching this breakdown video on my website, go to the analysis and discussion section, and I'm going to post the study I did into the comment section. I highly recommend that you guys watch the video within this article to understand my thinking for how this fight is likely to go. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll leave a link to this article in the description below. I highly, highly, highly recommend you watch the video within this article for the study that I conducted on home advantage in this part of the world, if you're thinking of betting this fight, because this is the exact type of fight where I think home advantage can be a really big deal for all the reasons that I'll get into now. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds, we can see that Ian Garry is a 1.37 favourite, which is going to be minus 271 for an implied probability of 73%. Belal Muhammad, 3.11 underdog, which is going to be plus 211 for an implied probability of 32%. So let's take a look at the fighter comparison, and then we will get into, in fact, we don't have a lot of data for Ian Garry, and the reason being the automated system that I've built has been confused by the fact that Ian Garry has got 3 names. It struggles with little things like that. I need to obviously develop it and make it more robust to deal with edge cases like this, which is why Ian Garry's image isn't generating. So we'll work blind on this one. We won't take a look at the comparison. We'll talk about how these two match up from a stylistic point of view. So this, in my opinion, is a very, very, very dangerous fight for Ian Garry, because we know, we've covered in the study, home advantage is a very big deal in this part of the world, and it's not too often that you see Ian Garry go out there and dominate his opponents beyond all reasonable doubt. Like, if you look at the Michael Page fight, it was kind of close and competitive. If you look at the Jeff Neal fight, it was kind of close and competitive. And the guys that Garry is looking good against, guys like Neil Magny, guys like Carlos Prates, although he did struggle in the second half of the Prates fight, present very different challenges to Garry compared to Belal. And so when we've seen Garry face like a decent level of opponent, guys like Page, guys like Jeff Neal, He's been dragged into razor close fights. And we know home advantage is a big deal in this part of the world. And in order to beat a Muslim in a country like Qatar, you've either got to have to finish him, and Ian Garry isn't a finisher. We can see by his record, his last 5 fights have gone to a decision, and Belal Muhammad is very tough. So you've either got to finish Belal, which ain't going to be easy, or you've got to win 2 out of 3 rounds beyond all reasonable doubt, dominantly to the point where the judges can't possibly fuck it up, which is going to be a very difficult thing to do in a fight like this, because Belal Muhammad has a style which can make judging very, very subjective. So, God, this is a really complex fight. This fight here, guys, is why you need to be in my live betting group. I know I keep saying that it is an absolute no-brainer to join my live betting group, but this is the reason why you need to be in it. Because if we take a look at the profitability chart for live betting, these are the type of fights we perform extremely well on. You can see over the long term we've made a profit on 73% of months. Like, every single person watching this video should be in the live betting group, because this level of consistency and performance over a 10-year period is utterly absurd. And if you want to make money watching the sport you love, there are very few better ways to do it than joining my live betting group. And this type of fight is the perfect type of fight for us to perform well on and snipe a win and make some profit. Because when you look at the guys that Garry's been facing, none of them have really tested him in the way that Belal will. So Carlos Prates is a striker. Rakhmonov is a very strong grappler, but as you can see, if you go back and watch that fight, Rakhmonov didn't actually try to take Garry down very hard. Page is a striker, Jeff Neal's a striker, Magny's a striker, Daniel Rodriguez is a striker, Keenan Song is a striker, Gabe Green is a striker, Darian Weeks is a striker, Jordan Williams is a striker, right? So we've never seen Ian Garry face a very high level MMA grappler, which Belal Muhammad is. As much as people don't like Belal Muhammad, he is one of the best MMA grapplers in the division. He's got the cardio to spam takedowns relentlessly for 3 rounds. He's got brilliant takedown entries, slick back takes, and while he might not have the best grappling control, he is getting better in that area. We saw that in the Leon Edwards fight. And so Ian Garry has essentially gone from facing a bunch of strikers to now facing one of the best MMA grapplers in the division, who's a cardio machine and who will have home advantage on his side. Wiki cappers, or people with hazy memories of how the Rakhmonov fight went, will feel immensely confident in Garry's chances of neutralising the threat of Belal Muhammad's wrestling this weekend, because Rakhmonov is obviously one of the strongest MMA grapplers in the UFC, let alone the division. So the fact that Garry was able to, for the most part, keep the Rakhmonov fight standing is a huge factor to take into consideration, right? Because Rakhmonov is a better MMA grappler than Belal Muhammad. The problem is not all takedown entries are created equal. And if you go back and watch the Rakhmonov fight in the cold light of day, all the takedown entries from Rakhmonov for the most part were very, very high above Garry's hips. You know, they were takedown entries that didn't really get in on Garry's legs, didn't really do a particularly good job of trying to upset Garry's balance. And so they were much easier for Garry to deal with than the type of takedown entry that Belal Muhammad typically shoots, which is a bit of a paradox, right? It doesn't make sense, because if Rakhmonov's a better MMA grappler than Belal Muhammad and Garry neutralised the threat of Rakhmonov's grappling, how can we now say that Belal Muhammad poses a bigger threat when it comes to grappling than Rakhmonov? That just doesn't make sense, right? But ultimately, all we can do is assess a fighter based on the skills they demonstrate in the octagon. And the level of takedown defense that Garry demonstrated against Rakhmonov was very inconclusive, because Rakhmonov wasn't really shooting particularly good takedown entries. They weren't well timed, and like I say, they were very high up above Garry's hips. So when you look at a guy like Belal Muhammad, he can spam takedowns for 15 minutes relentlessly. He can shoot in deep on the legs. He's got great timing on those double leg entries, and he can apply a lot of pressure as well. Yes, he struggled very bad against Jack Della Maddalena, but he was still in Maddalena's face for the full 25 minutes, walking him down, taking a lot of damage, and applying that constant pressure, which does set up his takedown entries, because Belal Muhammad forces you to fight in a very uncomfortable range. And while Garry is a very good counter striker, Belal Muhammad is going to be obviously shooting on him relentlessly in an effort to get this fight to the ground, and we don't know how Garry is going to deal with that. So that complicates this fight immensely, because Garry typically doesn't have a judge-pleasing style. Garry's style of fighting has historically been punished quite brutally and unfairly by judges, because what Garry wants to do is use his incredible footwork and movement and ability to counter-strike to bounce around on the outside and chip away at you with a heavy counter-striking game plan. He wants to jab you to death and leg kick you to death from the outside. The problem is, bad, uneducated, corrupt and biased judges, and unfortunately we have a lot of those that judge UFC fights, quite often punish fighters that are fighting on the outside and counter-striking, and they favour things that they shouldn't favour because they're secondary and thirdly scoring criteria now in 2025. But of course we do see some bad judges score fights based on old criteria, and they score things like octagon control and aggression higher than they should. Okay, so this is a very dangerous fight for Garry, because in order for him to win this fight, he's got to put 2 dominant rounds in the bank if he doesn't finish Belal, which we've already said is unlikely. And if we know Belal is going to be the one coming forward with a lot of forward pressure, a lot of aggression, probably controlling Garry in the clinch a lot up against the cage, probably, you know, spend a lot of time working with takedowns, might get the odd takedown here and there, might end the round in a dominant position or steal a round with a takedown. I think this becomes a very dangerous fight for Garry, because if you think about one of the ways this fight is very likely to go, in my head I can visualize Garry kind of dancing around Muhammad and chipping away at him with the jab and stuffing the majority of Belal's takedown attempts. But I can also see Garry being forced to use the cage to defend a lot of those takedown attempts, which will gift control time to Belal Muhammad. And with Belal Muhammad having home advantage on his side for this fight, and us knowing that Muslims beat non-Muslims around 70% of the time in this part of the world, I think this is one of those fights where Belal actually has a pretty fucking good chance of winning. Maybe not legitimately. You know, I'm pretty confident Garry will win this fight in a fair, honest and just world, but with how bad and corrupt and dirty judging is, I just think it's going to be very difficult for Garry to go to Doha and beat Belal Muhammad in Qatar. I think it's going to be extremely difficult. So from a betting point of view, I don't see there's any way that you can bet Ian Garry in this fight. The home advantage is a big enough red flag that when you see the implied probability of 73% on Garry, even if you think you know Ian Garry's going to win easily, even if you're, you know, Layla, or even if you're Ian Garry's mum, you can't touch him at an implied probability of 73%. It's too damn risky. So if you want to bet this fight, you've got to take Belal Muhammad or nothing, in my opinion, in my humble opinion. This is Belal Muhammad or nothing. And from a pre-fight betting point of view, a fight like this is very complicated, because if you bet on Belal Muhammad at an implied probability of 32%, you are putting your money in a lot of danger, because you know Garry is a bad stylistic matchup for him. Garry is a lot younger, Garry is improving, Garry's got great footwork, great movement, much better striking, reasonably good takedown defense. You know this is going to be a tough fight for Belal. You know he isn't the most likely to win. So if you bet him, you're putting your money in a shit ton of danger. So it's difficult to bet Belal in this fight, but it's also difficult to bet Garry because of how many things he's going to have to overcome. And you know it's not probably going to be enough for Garry to win the fight. He's going to have to dominate the fight or finish Belal to win the fight, which is very difficult to do with how tough and well-rounded and durable, how great Belal's cardio is, right? So this is the perfect sort of fight for live betting. This is the type of fight which we perform very, very well on. This is the type of fight that contributes to us making a profit on 73% of events. Because what we're going to be able to do is pay very close attention to all the action in each of the rounds and kind of work out who is more likely to have won those rounds based on everything that we see, based on how judges in this part of the world have scored fights exactly like this in the past, And hopefully we're going to be able to snipe a live bet and a profit on a fight like this. This is the type of fight which is our bread and butter. And I'm very, very confident we'll make another profit this weekend. We make a profit almost every week in live betting. And this is a perfect sort of fight to make some money on. Minefield for pre-fight betting, but a fucking gold mine for live betting. So I'll be very, very much targeting this fight in live betting, because we know so much about both guys. These are the type of fights where we have a very big edge. So if you're not in the live betting group, ask yourself why the fuck not. Do you want to make money most weeks? If the answer is yes, you join the group. So if we take a look at the over-under on this one, obviously both these guys are kind of decisionators, so very likely this fight goes to a decision. The odds reflect that. If we take a look at the prop bets on this one, I think the most likely outcome is going to be Garry by decision, but you don't even get even money on that. The odds are absolutely terrible. So, you know, if you look at the odds on Belal to win by decision, they're also terrible. They're only about 25% better than his money lines. So there's no point in getting cute and betting on Belal Muhammad to win by decision, because if Garry gets injured or if there's a disqualification or something, you'd be really pissed at betting Belal by decision for just a 25% bump in the odds. You're better off taking Belal money line if you want to bet this fight pre-fight, but this one, these type of fights are absolutely gold for live betting, so I'll personally be focusing more on live instead, and I hope you found that useful. Now let's move on to the next one. Now let's break down the fight between Volkan Oezdemir and Alonzo Menifield, and we'll start off by taking a look at the odds. So we can see Oezdemir is a 1.43 favourite, which is going to be minus 235 for an implied probability of 70%. And if we take a look at the odds on Menifield, he's about a 2.87 underdog, which is going to be plus 187 for an implied probability of 35%. So if we take a look at the fighter comparison, we can see that both guys are about the same age and about the same size. Nothing too major going on there. But in terms of the stats, we can see Oezdemir lands around 30% more strikes per minute, which is pretty huge. And in terms of the accuracy and defense, they're about the same. You can also see they're both very, very difficult to take down, and neither of them actually try to take their opponents down that often. They average just half a takedown attempt per 15-minute fight. So very likely we're going to get a stand-up fight here. In terms of the strike distribution chart, you can see Alonzo Menifield doesn't really bother throwing many shots to the legs or the body. Oezdemir does mix it up a bit more, throwing over 20% of his strikes to the legs and body. And we do know Oezdemir does have very, very nice leg kicks, although the best counter to a leg kick is a punch in the face. And we know that Mr. Menifield does punch very, very hard in the face. So I think a big stat to focus on for this matchup is going to be the fact that Oezdemir lands 30% more strikes per minute, because that's quite a wide margin. And with this very likely being a stand-up fight, because neither of them ever try to take their opponents down, that clearly gives Oezdemir an edge. So obviously we know Menifield hits very hard, but what we also know about Volkan Oezdemir is that he's very, very durable. If we take a look at his record, we can see that we take a look at his losses. He's only been knocked out twice in his entire career. Once by Daniel Cormier, and that wasn't really a knockout, came by a ground and pound. And then the only other occasion was against Garry. So we know he's very tough, we know he's very durable. So even though Menifield does have that true legit knockout power in every single shot, not easy to put Volkan Oezdemir away. Very tough, very durable. And so when we think about this fight logically, if we know it's likely to be a stand-up fight because neither guy ever tries to take their opponents down, and we know that Volkan Oezdemir lands, 30% more strikes per minute, unless Menifield can get the knockout, or he can rock Oezdemir in 2 out of the 3 rounds to use, big impactful strikes to steal rounds, he's more than likely going to get outstruck here and outworked, and will more than likely lose a decision. So for me personally, this is a very tough fight for betting, because the price on Oezdemir is very steep. You'd have to give Oezdemir a 75% chance or better of winning this in order to get any value on him, which is very difficult for me. But in a stand-up fight, I also don't want to be betting on the guy in Menifield, who isn't going to be able to match the volume of Oezdemir. Also, Menifield does slow down a bit as fights wear on, whereas Oezdemir's cardio is very good. So I very heavily lean towards Oezdemir in this fight. However, I think the odds are exactly where they should be, and Oezdemir's advantages very much reflect his odds, and so there ain't no value here. In terms of the over-under on this one, we can see that the over 1.5 rounds is set at about 1.6, so I actually think is pretty good value, and I'll probably be betting that myself, because if we look at their records, you can see that Oezdemir frequently fights with decision. You see decision in his last a decision in his last fight against Carlos Ulberg. And then if we go back a bit further on, plenty of decisions here. There are some duplicate entries there which I need to clean up on these two guys. Is it happening on more than one fighter? It's happening on, just appears to be happening on Oezdemir and Menifield. Getting some duplicate entries. How about Oralbai? No, Oralbai is clean. How about Hermansson? That's pretty clean as well. So not too sure what's happening with these fighters. Their records a little bit messed up, but all the same, I digress. Oezdemir frequently fights the decisions, and Menifield is a bit of a decisionator as well. You can see, plenty of decisions on his records. There's more than likely will go over 1.5 rounds. We know both guys are tough. We know both are durable. For the most part, Oezdemir is more of a volume striker. Menifield does have that true legit knockout power, but in 28 pro fights, Oezdemir has only been KO'd twice, so we know he can take it. So very likely this one goes over. Do like the over 1.5 rounds. And in terms of the prop bets on this one, I think most likely outcome is going to be Oezdemir by decision. The odds aren't great, but I think that is pretty likely to win. So I hope you found that useful, and now let's move on to the next fight. Now let's break down the fight between Jack Hermansson and Mick de Beck Oralbai, as Jack Hermansson drops down to the welterweight division. So we'll start off by taking a look at the odds on this one. We can see that Oralbai is a pretty big favourite at average odds of about 1.40, which is minus 250 for an implied probability of 71%. If we take a look at the odds on Hermansson, he's around an average of 2.97, which is going to be plus 197 for an implied probability of 34%. Now, earlier on in the week, I did throw Orolbai into a parlay with Tsarukyan. I think I bet this on Monday. So Orolbai's odds have declined quite a bit since then. They've declined by about 25%. So whether you still want to place that parlay if you haven't already is up to you. But I am betting Orolbai and Tsarukyan together in a parlay. I think they're very likely to win for the reasons that I will explain in this video. So we take a look at the stats for this one. The first thing I like about Orolbai in this matchup is that he's 10 years younger than Jack Hermansson, and we know that statistically the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time when there's a 10-year age gap in a fight. So that doesn't go the whole way towards justifying a bet on Orolbai at his current odds at an implied probability of 71%. But if you were to bet Orolbai earlier in the week like we did when his odds were about 1.5 or minus 200, he would have had a bit of margin of value on the age stat, because obviously if we know fighters that are 10 years younger than their opponent win around 70% of the time, and the implied probability on Orolbai's odds of 67%, that gives us a nice 3% margin over the bookie before we even get into all the other advantages Orolbai has. So before we get into those advantages, another advantage Orolbai has is home advantage. So we know that Muslims beat non-Muslims in places like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates around 70% of the time. So you've already got two very strong trends in Orolbai's favour here, with him being a lot younger than Hermansson, also having home advantage. We know that in order for Hermansson to win this fight this weekend, he's probably going to have to finish Orolbai, which is going to be very difficult because Hermansson's not really a finisher. Orolbai showed in the Rebecca fight he's tough as nails, or Hermansson is going to have to win 2 out of 3 rounds pretty dominantly, which again is going to be a very difficult thing to do because Orolbai is pretty damn good everywhere. Now, in terms of the other physical stats, we can see that Hermansson has a 3-inch height advantage, 3-inch reach advantage, and a massive 7-inch leg reach advantage, which is very nice and quite surprising actually. He has very, very long legs, abnormally long legs, and these 3 size advantages certainly all compound to give Hermansson a pretty nice edge in this one. Now, when we look at the stats, you can see that Hermansson throws a hell of a lot of strikes per minute, but the reason why Oralbai's strikes per minute is so low is because so much of his fights in the UFC have been spent in grappling positions where obviously he's not going to be landing as many strikes. In terms of the accuracy, though, they're about the same. Hermansson far better defensively. Probably the Rebecki fight is massively impacting the accuracy of Orolbai's striking defense, but you can see Oralbai has a big advantage when it comes to the amount of takedowns he attempts in a 15-minute period, and shooting almost 6 takedown attempts on average in a 15-minute period is very, very high. Hermansson very difficult to take down though, and if you look at the striking distribution chart, you can see Hermansson also makes use of those long legs with nice leg and body kicks, and throws almost 30% of his strikes to legs and body, which is well above average. So if we just take a look at Orolbai's record, he has had, this will be his 5th fight in the UFC, and you can see from his stats that he's very aggressive with the takedowns. So he shot 10 takedowns against Uros Medic, 17 against Elvis Brenner, 5 against Mateusz Rebecki, and 5 against Musiev. So Oralbai is very, very aggressive with the takedown. Spams takedowns, has really good cardio, and can go hard for 3 rounds, no problem. And this is the main reason why I like Oralbai in this fight. So I don't want to make this breakdown video super long, but I've already kind of explained why I think Oralbai is a very good bet in this matchup in my breakdown for the fight between Belal Muhammad and Ian Garry, because I'll just go over it as quick as I can. I'm really sorry if you've watched that breakdown, because I'll be repeating myself for the most part here, but we know home advantage is huge in this part of the world, right? And Oralbai is a Muslim, Jack Hermansson is not. So we know Muslims beat non-Muslims about 70% of the time in this part of the world. And when you consider the style of Jack Hermansson and the style of a guy like Ian Garry, they don't have judge-pleasing styles. So Hermansson has a very similar style to Ian Garry, where he likes to bounce around on the outside, chip away at you from behind the jab, behind the leg kick, and just outpoint you basically. He doesn't land particularly hard damaging strikes, and he's not a particularly good MMA grappler either. He's got the odd submission win here and there, but for the most part, Hermansson, not the best MMA grappler. And so, in order for Hermansson to beat Oralbai this weekend, in my opinion, he's got to either finish Oralbai, or he's got to win 2 rounds very dominantly. Because I think if these rounds are anywhere near close, based on home advantage, the judges will give Oralbai the nod. So when you look at the styles that guys like Hermansson and Garry bring to the table, where they're going to be bouncing around on the outside, chipping away from behind the jab, it's not going to be too difficult for guys like Belal Muhammad or Oralbai to build a case where the judges can just score the fight for them. Because if Oralbai does come out and throws 10 takedown attempts or 17 takedown attempts, or keeps up this volume of takedown attempts on Hermansson, it's going to wear Hermansson down, which will slow down his footwork and slow down his volume on the feet. But it's also going to smother him in pressure. It's going to give octagon control to Oralbai. It's going to make Oralbai the aggressor. And it's just going to be very difficult for Hermansson to keep Oralbai off of him and be able to outpoint Oralbai with punches and kicks. This is one of those fights which I think is a very difficult stylistic matchup for Hermansson, because I don't think his striking is at a dominant enough level which is going to stop Oralbai from grabbing a hold of him and just tying him up in the clinch and just wearing him out and taking him down. So early in the fight, Hermansson's going to be light on his feet. He's going to be moving well. Oralbai might struggle a bit. I think if Oralbai keeps coming with the takedown attempts like he has done in every single fight in the UFC so far, I think that this will be a very tough fight for Hermansson. This is one where I'm very much leaning into how difficult it's going to be for Hermansson to win a decision against a Muslim in this part of the world. And with Oralbai also being 10 years younger, this being Hermansson's first weight cut down to welterweight, which is going to be a pretty brutal one, I would imagine. And the fact that Hermansson already slows down in most fights, and for me, there's a lot of reasons to like Oralbai in this one. I think he stands a very, very good chance of winning. Apologies for that. We will bring the research tool back up. So, in terms of the over-under on this one, very likely this one goes to a decision in my opinion. And you can see the odds reflect that. Pretty steep favourite odds on this fight to go to decision. I think most likely outcome is going to be Oralbai by decision, but the odds are not going to be great on that. So yeah, I've bet Oralbai, thrown him in a parlay with Tsarukyan, and hopefully he comes through for us. So I hope you found that useful. Let's now move on to the next one. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Waldo Cortes-Acosta versus Shamil Gaziev. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds, we can see that Gaziev is the slight favourite at average odds of about 1.70, which is going to be minus 143 for an implied probability of 59%. Take a look at the odds on Cortes-Acosta. He's around an average of 2.16, which is going to be plus 116 for an implied probability of 46%. There's a lot to unpack on this fight. Let's start off by talking about the fact that Waldo Cortes-Acosta is coming in on about 2 or 3 days notice. So super short notice. It is very rare that a fighter wins on short notice like that. Of course, we saw Ewing looked great last weekend against Wellmaker, coming on just a few days notice, but he had fought the previous Saturday. Waldo Cortes-Acosta last fought back in November, so 3 weeks ago, and obviously it was a tough fight. He was fouled very badly and then managed to score a flash knockout out of nowhere. The fight only did last 4 minutes, so it's not like it was a war, not like he would have taken tons of damage in that fight, not like it was a real war of attrition that would have broken his body down and taken him weeks to recover. The fight did only last 4 minutes. So what's interesting about this matchup is if both guys were coming into the fight on a full camp and on neutral territory, I would favour Waldo Cortes-Acosta here, just because his cardio is brilliant for a heavyweight. That's a big factor that goes into it. But stylistically, I also think he's a pretty difficult fight for Gaziev. I think he's going to probably be able to use the same game plan and strategy that Rosenstrike used, but actually have a lot more success with it because he throws much more volume than Rosenstrike. And so I do heavily favour Waldo Cortes-Acosta in this one. I just don't feel great about betting a guy coming on 2-3 days notice, especially because Gaziev has got home advantage on his side, and we know that Muslims beat non-Muslims around 70% of the time in this part of the world. I want to be betting with strong trends in our favour. It's why we're going to be betting guys like Ulanbekov and Almabayev and Tsarukyan and Orolbai on cards like this. We want to be betting with strong trends on our side. We don't want to be fighting the strong trends. But Waldo Cortes-Acosta is a very tempting bet here. I will say this: we do live bet pretty much every Waldo Cortes-Acosta fight. This guy has been an absolute money train for us over the years. We've made a lot of money live betting on Waldo Cortes-Acosta fights, and this one is another great fight for live betting. If you do your homework on this one, I think this is one where you could potentially make a lot of money and a very, very good, very good profit. So if you're not in the live betting group, ask yourself why, because we make a profit almost every month of the year, 73% a month on the vast majority of UFC events, 68% events. So jump on board, because over the last 10 years we have done incredible things, and we will continue to do incredible things. As you can see, our profits are trending up extremely nicely. So let's get into the fighter comparison. So both guys are about the same age. you can see that Gaziev has an 8-inch reach advantage, which is very nice, and a slight leg reach advantage. But this is where things really start to get difficult for Gaziev, because Waldo Cortes-Acosta lands 132% more strikes per minute, more than double the number of strikes per minute that Gaziev lands. He's also a lot better defensively, and when you look at the grappling stats, obviously, you know, Waldo Cortes-Acosta's takedown defense isn't bulletproof at 67%, but he is making big improvements to his takedown defense. So when Waldo Cortes-Acosta first came into the UFC, he was quite easy to take down and control. He's far more difficult now. And what's also interesting is that Gaziev doesn't actually shoot that many takedown attempts. Maybe shoots 1 or 2 takedowns per round. And you can see that when he starts to get tired, he prefers to stand and strike, which is why you can see Gaziev only averages around 1 takedown per 15 minutes, which is far lower than most of you are probably expecting. But if you do go back and watch Gaziev's fights, this stat is backed up by the footage. Gaziev really doesn't grapple anywhere near as much as he should. In terms of the striking distribution chart, both guys very much favour the head. Cortes-Acosta has started to throw really nice combinations of the body though, which will be huge for slowing down Gaziev, who already has a tendency to slow down as fights wear on. So from my perspective, it's a very good stylistic matchup for Waldo Cortes-Acosta, simply because he is becoming more difficult to take down. So if you look at his takedown defense stats from his last 3 fights, we don't have them going back further yet, although the UFC research tool is constantly updating with more information for fighters. But we can see his takedown defense stats from his last 3 fights, and you can see that he's defended a grand total of 10 takedowns across his last 3 fights, and he's only given up 2 of them against Sergey Spivak. So he's defended 8 of the last 10 takedown attempts his opponents have thrown at him, and his takedown defense is getting far better. So Gaziev is one of these guys that, you know, does have a very heavy top game. If he does get on top of you, he's very good at holding you down and controlling you. However, Gaziev is a bit stiff and a bit flat-footed, so his takedown entries do tend to come quite high above his opponent's hips, and he's not the best offensive wrestler. So I think Cortes-Acosta has got a great chance of winning this fight, because he's not the easiest to take down, and Gaziev's not the best offensive wrestler. So if Waldo Cortes-Acosta can keep this fight standing, I think it's going to look very similar to the Gaziev fight against Jairzinho Rozenstruik, where he only managed to complete 1 of 7 takedowns, and on top of that, he basically got his face jabbed off to the point where the fight was stopped in the 4th round. He ate a massive volume of strikes in that fight. Rozenstruik inflicted a lot of damage with the jab, and the jab just happens to be Waldo Cortes-Acosta's best weapon. So if this fight were taking place on neutral territory and they were both coming on a full camp, I would be all over Waldo Cortes-Acosta here. I'm still very tempted to bet him, because I think this is a dreadful stylistic matchup for Gaziev. But with Waldo Cortes-Acosta coming on like 2-3 days notice and Gaziev having home advantage, it's a lot more risky to bet Waldo Cortes-Acosta. I guess you've got to ask yourself if you feel comfortable taking on those risk factors at an implied probability of 46%, 2.16, minus 116. I'm not sure how I feel about it. I'm going to give this one some more thought, but I heavily lean towards Waldo Cortes-Acosta, and I would not be betting Gaziev this weekend because it's a bad stylistic matchup for him. Cortes-Acosta absolutely has the takedown defense and the boxing to do to Gaziev exactly what Rozenstruik did to him, but even more effectively, because Cortes-Acosta, in my opinion, has better takedown defense than Rozenstruik, and also throws a far higher volume of strikes than Rozenstruik as well. Rozenstruik's a little bit passive. Cortes-Acosta, he gets very, very busy. So in terms of the over-under on this one, I do think it's pretty likely this fight goes deep. They're both tough fuckers. Gaziev showed that, and we can see that the over is currently set at about 1.50 minus 200. I'll probably bet that. I think there's a very good chance that hits. And I think the most likely outcome on this one is going to be Cortes-Acosta to win by decision. I think he just jabs Gaziev's face off for 3 rounds and wins very, very comfortably. So I hope you found that useful. Now let's move on to the next. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Tagir Ulanbekov versus Kyoji Horiguchi. So Ulanbekov is a 1.48 favourite, which is going to be minus 208 for an implied probability of 68%. Horiguchi 2.68 underdog, which is going to be plus 168 for an implied probability of 37%. So I do think Ulanbekov is a very good bet in this fight, and in this breakdown we're mostly going to be focused on that. So let's start off by looking at the fighter comparison tool, and obviously it goes without saying, we've spoken about this in pretty much every fight on this card. Ulanbekov should have home advantage on his side. He should have Khabib in his corner, and we know Muslims beat non-Muslims around about 70% of the time in this part of the world. So in order for Horiguchi to win this fight, he's going to either need to knock Ulanbekov out, which will be very difficult because Horiguchi doesn't really have knockout power and Ulanbekov is tough as nails, or he's going to need to win 2 out of 3 rounds dominantly enough to the extent that the judges can't possibly score those rounds for Ulanbekov, which again will be very difficult because of how tough and well-rounded Ulanbekov is. So if we look at the fighter comparison physical stats, you can start to see more advantages start to accrue for Ulanbekov. So he's got a 2-inch height advantage, a 4-inch reach advantage, and a 2-inch leg reach advantage. So even though in isolation none of these size advantages is particularly big or significant, you can compound them together and also add in the home advantage, and the advantages for Ulanbekov really start to rack up. Now, we do have some statistics for Horiguchi, however, they're not that useful just because these stats were accrued from such a long time ago. So if we take a look at Horiguchi's record, you can see that he hasn't fought in the UFC since all the way back in 2016. So he's been out of the UFC for 9 years, and so those stats are probably not too relevant or useful anymore, and I would imagine a hell of a lot has changed with his style since then. So when it comes to Horiguchi, you know, he is good, he's tough, he's well-rounded, trains at American Top Team, but this is a very, very difficult stylistic matchup for him because of how tough and how well-rounded Ulanbekov is. So what I really like about Ulanbekov is that he mixes up his striking and grappling very nicely. He's a physically imposing grappler. He's got great cardio. He's got good enough cardio to spam takedowns for 3 rounds if he wants to. Reasonably good striker as well. Moves well on the feet. Doesn't have a whole lot of power, but he's pretty damn technical. Good grappling control. And we know that Horiguchi doesn't have the best takedown defense. So from my perspective, this is a great fight for Ulanbekov because he's got home advantage. He's bigger than Horiguchi. He's the, you know, I'm not going to say he's the better striker, but I don't think Horiguchi has a massive advantage when it comes to striking here. I think Ulanbekov's size will certainly help him to chip away at Horiguchi from a safe distance with those jabs and the leg kicks that Ulanbekov likes to throw out there. And with Horiguchi not having the best takedown defense, with Ulanbekov having that size, that physicality, that cardio that enables him to grapple hard for 3 rounds, I just see Ulanbekov being able to drag Horiguchi to the ground, wet blanket him, and win a pretty comfortable decision. This is one of those fights where, like I say, home advantage pretty big in matchups like this, and Ulanbekov is a strong enough grappler to kind of wet blanket, smother, out grapple, and hold down the smaller, less physically imposing Horiguchi. So it's a good fight, Ulanbekov. I would expect him to win. I am going to be betting the fight this weekend. It's a very, very good stylistic matchup for him. Like I say, if you look at his record, he's undefeated since he fought Tim Elliott all the way back in 2022, and he's picked up some wins against some decent opponents. Bruno Silva, no picnic. Alan Nascimento, I mean, it wasn't a good performance against Nascimento. He kept pulling guard, but he's improved a lot since then. You know, Cody Durden, Clayton Carpenter, Azat Maxim. I actually think Maxim is a better fighter than Horiguchi, so pretty good wins, and I do think Ulanbekov very, very likely to get the job done this weekend. And so if we look at the over-under, very likely to go to a decision this. Both guys are kind of decisionators. Horiguchi does have a lot of his fights over the last few years end inside the distance, but these have been against a lower level of opponent. His record's all messed up. I need to work on this. There's all kind of duplicate entries and stuff, so I need to clean that up. I think I have actually cleaned that up in the code, but we need to apply historical fixes to sort all that shit out. But anyway, yeah, very likely this fight will go to a decision in my opinion, but the odds reflect that. Very steep favourite odds on it to go to a decision. And if we take a look at the prop bets, the only prop I would consider would be Ulanbekov by decision. Like I say, home advantage, bigger, stronger, more physically imposing, you know, pretty good on the feet as well. Moves well, technical, throws a decent volume of strikes. I think Ulanbekov gets it done this weekend. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. If you did and you're watching on YouTube, please hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. Check out my website, link in the description below, and consider joining my live betting group if you want to make a profit on almost every UFC event. Who wouldn't want to do that? So check out my live betting group. You won't regret it. You'll absolutely love it. But till next time, have a great week. Love you all. And I will speak to you very, very soon. Nice one, guys. Take care. Bye.